Hi everyone, how are you doing? My name is Alyssa Gandini. I'm speaking from Brazil, São Paulo, and I am a Brazilian filmmaker and also gender equality activist. So I am very happy to be here, very excited to be here today with you all, and I want to welcome you to the Girls Education and Gender Equality Live on the International Social Impact Conference. So, the conference is producing a series of lives with some of the most influential people in the world to raise funds for international organizations, NGOs, and social projects that are helping vulnerable populations during the COVID-19 pandemic. The NGO that will be supported on this live is the Malala Fund. So, the Malala Fund invests in education programs to provide free, safe, and quality education for every girl in development countries. The guest of this live today is Abby DeRay. Abby grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and she has lived in the UK since 2001. She studied law at the University of Wolverhampton and has a Master Science in International Project Management from Glasgow Caledonian University, as well as a Master Arts in Creative Writing at Birkbeck University of London. Her book, called The Girl with the Louding Voice, won the BAFTA Novel Award for unpublished manuscripts in 2018 and was also selected as a finalist in the 2018 The Literary Consultancy Pen Factor competition. Abby lives in Essex with her husband and two daughters, who inspired her to write her debut novel. The interviewers of this live are going to be Mariam and Naval Riemann. Mariam and Naval became activists when they were 8 years old. Wow. And started inspiring girls in the village in Pakistan to continue their education when poverty was leading them to quit school and work instead. The now 18-year-old twin sisters have since worked in their local and global community for causes including girls' education in Pakistan and around the world, climate justice, gender equality, and inclusivity. They even have their own nonprofit organization, The World with Mariam and Vol, that uses advocacy, storytelling, and development to take action and inspire others to do the same. I really hope you enjoyed this live. I'm very excited about it too. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Welcome, Abby, to this conversation. We're so excited to be with you today and to be asking you some questions about your work and your thoughts on gender equality and how we can all work together to achieve gender equality around the world.
Thank you
So,
for having me. So excited to be here as well.
of course, yeah, we're so excited to have you too. I guess our first question then is, can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences growing up in Nigeria and how they inspired your book, The Girl with the Louding Voice?
Thank you. So, The Girl with the Louding Voice is a novel, it's fiction, but it was inspired by my childhood, as you said. I grew up in Lagos, which is a city in Nigeria, and I grew up in a middle class neighborhood. So, that meant that we didn't lack for anything. I was quite privileged in the sense that I had an education and I had access to some of the luxuries, as you would call it then. But one thing I noticed growing up was that around my neighborhood and including my family, we had what we call housemaids, which is young girls or boys that were working for families, doing the chores in the family, and living with these families. Now, majority of these housemaids were girls, which is why we call them housemaids. And they would work and clean and do, and like I said, do most of the chores. And I noticed as a child growing up that while I would get dressed and go off to school, these girls would still be at home. And when I get back, they would still be at home, still doing some of this work. And I had questions that I didn't voice out then. One, because I was young, it was happening around me. I thought it was the norm. It was the norm. It was a social and acceptable norm. But also because I grew up in a society where children really are not supposed to really speak up. So you sort of internalize your thoughts and feelings. And I think that's part of where my writing came from. So I had questions, but I didn't ask them. Now, when I left Nigeria and had my own children, it actually took me having my own children to be able to reflect back on this aspect of my childhood. Because when my daughter turned 8, we had a conversation about her helping out with the chores at home. And her reaction was one of really throwing tantrums and saying, I don't want to do this. And me saying to her, look, do you know that girls like you that are probably working for families in Nigeria? And so that led to a series of questions of her asking why, what would lead a girl to go and work for a family. And so I said to myself, actually, those were questions I had as well growing up. And so I sat down that evening, we had that conversation, and I began to try to do some research to try and understand, where these girls come from. Now, I came across an article that evening about this 13-year-old girl who had hot water poured on her by the woman who employed her. She was a housemaid. And one thing I noticed was that the article blurred out her face and everything else about her, apart from the fact that she had been scoured with hot water and was a maid. And so that led me asking the question, who is this girl? Which is why I then wrote the book, which is The Girl with the Loud Voice.
Yeah, and that's so, important, raising your voice, and the way that you were able to incorporate these questions that you had in your story are so special. And it actually reminds us of our experiences in Pakistan because we grew up there until we were 5, and a
Wow.
similar situation where, there were housemaids and people who worked at your houses. For everyone who was from middle class to like the ultra rich families, but it was very common for even children to be working in these houses. And our experience in our village was one where our grandmother had donated some land to have a school built for
Right.
girls in our village. And when we were 8 years old, at the time we had moved to Canada and it was on a family trip back to Pakistan, that we talked to these girls and they told us that they would quit school when they reached grade 5 to be able to work as housemaids. And
Wow.
it was because of like
Yeah.
the poverty in the village and things like that, but we couldn't relate to that because we, growing up in Canada or having like school over there, we couldn't even imagine that children would no longer go to school or they would quit school at such a young age. And so, what we decided to do was dedicate our time and effort to trying to inspire those girls to continue their education. And
That's
I
incredible.
thank you so much. And actually, like, I think what's been so amazing is to see their resilience and their, I guess, their drive to want to go to school, and that has led them to actually continuing on to high school. And being a part of that journey has been such an honor for us. But that's why we connected with your book so much and the topic of the book, because it is just so powerful when girls take charge of their futures. Like they're able to do anything, and gender equality issues, they vary across different contexts and different countries, but they're also very similar. And so I think that whether it's Nigeria or Pakistan, there's incredible girls in all of these countries, and if they're given the resources like an education to be able to succeed, they're going to be able to do that. So yeah.
Absolutely. I came across a staggering statistic that 64% of girls would not be married if they were able to complete their secondary education. So that's like more than half. To think about
Mhm.
that, and many of the reasons why these girls go into early marriage is because the education is taken out from them. So it's
Yes.
really shocking just what
Mhm.
that can do.
Absolutely. And your book actually, covers a lot of social issues like child marriage and poverty and slavery as well, while also covering themes like women empowerment and agency. And so, why was it important for you to combine these topics as you crafted the storyline of your book?
Thank you for that. So it wasn't, I would say it was not completely deliberate, right? But
Okay.
I found that it was nearly impossible to write a story about a girl who becomes a housemaid without understanding where she came from. And from my research and some of the girls that I knew growing up and some of the women that I saw as well, was that the foundation of this was from two things: poverty and gender inequality, gender discrimination. So for poverty was really, their family could not afford to educate them. And so the
Yeah.
next best thing was child marriage or go into child labor. For those that were not poor, so for some areas where they weren't actually poor, they could afford it. But it was the fact that you're a girl, you're seen as a commodity. So I do not want to invest in your education. I would rather
Yeah.
invest in property or invest in travel or invest in anything else but in you, because you will get married, you change your name, drop the family name, and you cease to exist. So those were the things I found out. So it was nearly impossible for me to start a Dooney story, which is the main character in my book, without starting from where I felt the problem was from. Really, that was the
Mhm.
foundation. But then as she then moves to Lagos, where she sees wealth, so she lives with a wealthy family and becomes a housemaid. So driven by poverty and gender inequality and discrimination, she then moves into this where she sees the rich. But then she also realizes, looking at the women, so she takes a glimpse into the future and she sees that, wow, even with the education these people have, they still suffer from inequality. As women, we
Yes.
do. So regardless of where you are in the world, as a woman, you still suffer an element of inequality. And that is why we are, sort of advocating more for women's rights, for our voices to be heard more in society, for equal, for the gap between our pay to be the same with the men. And so she sees that, she has a glimpse of that. So I felt it would be fair for her to see that and understand that, look, using your voice doesn't stop at getting your education. It's just a springboard to you using your voice. It helps you to speak louder.
Exactly.
just like he's helped you both, but you don't stop there. You keep fighting. And so that was important. But also I figured out and realized the power of women empowerment and mentorship. So in my life, my mother is a huge mentor in my life because she's extremely educated and she's very powerful and she's a great advocate in a silent way for women's rights and education. And so I wanted to show that, but to also show that even if you don't have it in your mother or in your father or anywhere around you, you could still have somebody who's a mentor to you. So I always say to people that Michelle Obama is my mentor. She's never met me, but I follow her works and I see
Yes.
what she does and I'm inspired by her. So I wanted to show that look, whatever you do in your day-to-day life, whoever you are, somebody's looking at you and someone's learning from you. And so it's
Yes.
important for you to make sure that whatever you're doing is something that you're proud of doing. So that's why I try to show those themes. And it wasn't until I finished the book I realized, oh my gosh, this is a lot to cover. It's quite ambitious in scope, but I believe I managed to do it quite well.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the way that your story has been able to resonate with so many readers around the world, I think Aduni can also be one of those role models for a lot of young girls everywhere who may not see, themselves in stories like this one. And so it's just incredible the way that you've brought this story together. So thank you for your work. And that brings us to our next question, which is, what is the main message that you hope readers learn after reading this book? If there's one thing out of all of these different topics that you cover, what's the core message you hope that readers get?
Well, that's a hard one to think about just one thing. But I would say that really it's a story of resilience,
Yes.
right? And we're right now in the world where we're living in, we need resilience. We need to believe that. So Adini says something which is tomorrow will be better than today. And that's because she believes that what she can't have today, anything positive she can't have today, she can have it tomorrow. And so what I really want readers to take away is that belief in yourself, be resilient enough to reach for that which you believe, really reach for the stars and beyond. It's also a story of hope, inspiration, kindness. There's a lot to it, but I think the biggest thing for me is just that resilience and hope and believing in yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's having that as like one of the main messages is also another reason why a lot of people can relate to the book. It's because regardless of where you come from or what your background is, that's something that everyone can take away and like learn and apply in their own lives. And it's so important, especially in a story like Aduni's, like how she had to go through so many hurdles and challenges, but eventually she fought for what she believed in and she was able to make her dreams come true. And that's something that everyone can relate to. And once girls have an access to an education, then it just makes it that much easier for them to achieve their dreams. And it's just, I think that over here, especially in countries like Canada or the United States, sometimes there are people who can take their education for granted, or there's some areas where we think that, oh, like, our school is something that just everyone has access to. It can be easy to fall into that kind of bubble, but reading a story like Adoni's, like, you can find out how there's so many people who have to fight for that right. And even in the United States or even in Canada, there are challenges to education sometimes. And reading about people like this and reading these stories is so important to understanding those challenges, even if they are fiction, but there's important lessons to be learned there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And fiction is a reflection of reality as well. So,
Absolutely,
and,
yeah.
and like you said, if not, if because someone like me, I came from, like I said, I didn't come from poverty, but at a very young age, I learned the importance of having an education. So there are people that are given the opportunities and throw it away, right? So
Yes.
you have a choice. And this is me saying, look, it's a wonderful thing that you need to grab hold of. If you're given that, if you're not given that opportunity, please try and find it. And there are charities like yours, like you guys have, that are helping to do these things. They're helping to educate girls all over the world. And it's so important to have that as a foundation of life.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely. And as we strive to achieve gender equality and ensure that young girls and women everywhere have access to equal opportunities as men and boys, it's important for women to believe in themselves and their abilities to pursue their dreams. And part of what can inspire this shift is when young women see other women pursuing their passions. And so for girls who aspire to be authors, you are such an incredible role model. And so thank you for sharing your gift with all of us.
Thank
What advice do you have for an aspiring author out there who is perhaps watching this live stream or just sees your work, who wants to write a book and isn't sure how or doesn't believe that they can? What advice do you have for them?
So I would say that, you see, everyone says believe in yourself, and I said that as well. But sometimes it's hard to believe in yourself when you think that you're not good enough. And sometimes it's okay for a while to allow that a little bit of self doubt. It's okay for a while, but please don't dwell on it. So the first thing I would say is that while you have your self-doubt and wonder whether you're good enough, do not stop writing. So you don't have to share with anyone, just pick up something. So I started writing by taking out the and it's funny because I didn't realize that's when I started writing. My mother actually reminded me. So I was about 4 or 5, and I would take out the family albums and I'll put little speech bubbles in them, and that's the beginning of my storytelling, because I figured out why are they not speaking in the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
So I give them stories, and that was the beginning of it. And then that moved into journaling my thoughts. So I'd write, like I
Yeah.
said, why are housemaids being treated this way? I'd write it down in my journal. I never shared that with anyone, but I didn't stop that because I realized I love that. So if you have a passion and a love for writing, pick up anything you have and start using it to document your thoughts and feelings. Thankfully, we're in the age where we have blogs, you have, online, you have Wattpad, you have so many things that you can put your writing on. Do that if you're
Absolutely.
confident enough to. Malala is an example of someone whose her blog changed her entire life, because from there all sorts of things happened and she became a global voice for girl education worldwide. And then I would say that once you get into that point where you're writing quite often, look around for mentors, look around for, I always say to people that your mentor doesn't have to be someone that knows you. So I have a lot of mentors that are authors that have never met me, but I've got their books in my bookshelf, and I read their stories and I see what they've
Yeah.
written. So
Yeah.
that, so it goes hand in hand. Look for mentors and read, read, read. And then when you then get to the point where you feel a little bit confident, do try and reach out and share your stories with people, because people need to read your stories. They can't exist in isolation. You need to share them. And it took me years. So I've been writing for close to 10 years before I actually went out and entered into a competition, which is the next point. So if you don't want to reach out to publishers or publishing houses or agents, enter into competitions. That's such a great starting place for many authors like myself who feel that I might not be able to do this directly to a publisher. Enter into competitions and see what happens with that. And hopefully, if you don't give up, I'm hoping that by the time you've done all these things, you get to the point where you believe a little bit in yourself, and just keep up going. Don't stop. Don't give up on your dreams. And hopefully, we'll read your book someday. It'll be on the
Yeah.
shelf.
That's so amazing, and that's such great advice as well. I think that a lot of the time, even us growing up, we had such amazing authors that we would read about, and that really inspired us to write our own stories, but also share them with the world, not in book format, but also just in storytelling through like videos and films and things like that as well. I think that what's so important though is to make sure that your stories are heard, because then other people are encouraged to do the same. And while it might not always feel like you're represented in the media, you can be that voice for people who look like you, or people who relate to you, so that they can, be inspired to share their stories as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely. So it's an example of you using your voice, to be honest. Your writing, for me, I say to everyone, my pen is my voice. My stories are my voice. I tell those stories because I want to be heard. And I
Yeah.
think it's important for everyone to reach out for that and just find what your voice is. If it's for you storytelling, if it's through film, through media, through, songs, whatever it is, if it's writing,
Yeah.
please don't stop. I think the greatest tragedy is to give up.
Yes, exactly. And you also mentioned how, like, nowadays we have blogs and we have this atmosphere in which social media is a really powerful tool that can be used to amplify
Absolutely.
your own voice and share your work, right? And so, to everyone watching out here, we recommend that you also, use your social media accounts to be able to share your ideas, whether that's poetry, whether that is, excerpts from books that you're interested in writing, or things like that. It's just for us, it's always been about like photography and different types of media, like filmmaking as well. But again, like social media is a really powerful tool if you use it in that sense, and if you use it to also amplify your own voice. And so yeah, like that's also something to consider if you're not interested, if you don't want to, publish right away, or you're just looking for a way to get started. Social media is definitely a great tool to use.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and going off of that, it's important to for women's voices to be represented in the media, and women of color and stories of girls who are, aren't represented as often in the media. And do you want to build on that as well? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's also like in terms of girls who grow up and they see, books that they're reading, or they see, I guess, movies that they're watching. If they don't see themselves in those stories, it's actually like girls are much more likely to, not be, inspired to go in a certain career if they don't see women represented in that field or in the media where they see it. And so it's so important for stories to be representative of all that girls are doing, but also all that girls can do. So, why do you think it's important for the voices of girls like Aduni in your book, but also women in general and women of diverse backgrounds to be represented in the media as a whole?
Oh, it's absolutely critical, to be honest. It's something that I think that if it would be a tragedy if we were silenced, if we're not allowed to tell our stories as we see them. So I'll tell an example of a Denise story. I was speaking to a teacher who teaches girls in villages, and she said that when she read The Girl with the Loud Voice, she looked at the girls that she was teaching, and there was this particular girl who was basically like Aduni. And she made up her mind that, look, I will do my best for this girl and make sure that she gets her education. And then she comes from poverty, and that came from reading this book and realizing that there's a lot of potential in this girl. So girls that are in a Juni's background, or that have come from sort of poverty and child marriage and feel that that is the end for them, that is nothing else because they've been trapped in the situation. If they read Aduni's story as an example, they look at her, like you said, and think, if she can do it, I can. And the funny thing is, not even just people that are in Aduni's background. Anyone can look at those stories and relate to them.
Yeah.
It's same for me. When I read nonfiction books, I mean, I was reading Sheryl Sandberg's Lenin,
Yeah.
and around the same time, I was working my 9 to 5, and I was afraid to speak up about certain things I believed in and I wanted for myself. But reading that book and on trying to resonate with what she'd written there gave me a voice. So we kind of underestimate the power of representing yourself, your situation in stories, and because it gives a kind of power that no one can explain. I think the power is also in, because especially for books, I can talk for books. When you're reading a book, right, you automatically transpose yourself into that story. You are Aduni. You are
Yes.
whoever you're reading. And so there's something that happens in your subconscious that tells you, if she can, I can. And I'm going to reach out and do that. So I think it's critical. We need to have more stories like that. Before I wrote The Girl with the Loud Voice, there was more than enough on data, statistics all over the world on child marriage, on child labor. And then there was a lot of, data that felt very flat, because there was no story behind this data, right?
Mhm.
Some of them there was, but there wasn't anything that I could follow from end to end, where she started from and where this girl ended. And so I thought I could add to that by writing my
Yeah.
book. I give, even though it's fiction, I could tell a story and put that into the hands of millions that have not been able to reach it. And I did that, and thankfully there are people that are doing the same. So it's absolutely critical that
Mhm.
there's representation of people's stories, my stories, your
Yeah,
stories
yeah.
in fiction.
Yes, definitely. And I think that it's so important for organizations and people who have a big platform to be able to share those stories as well. We know that, so the Malala Fund is the organization that the funding from today's live will go to, or the fundraising that's done. And they actually have a great platform called Assembly, which amplifies the voices of girls all over the world. And it's basically a newsletter and a blog that they share. And it's so amazing to see the stories of girls that are featured on there, whether it's through like a day in the life or like them speaking about the issues that matter to them. I think that it's so amazing to see, especially now, how girls are given that platform to be able to share their voices, which might not have been around, like, in the past even 10 years. So yeah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and also, I think going off of like a point you made earlier about just like going beyond the statistic and the story and looking at the story behind it and how important that is. I definitely see that in a lot of issues that are portrayed in the world. There's just so much that we're exposed to nowadays in the media, and there's so many challenges like this thing is wrong in the world and this and this. I think after a certain point, people become, a certain level, they become desensitized towards it, and it doesn't affect them as much as a specific story would. And when we started our work, a lot of what was going into our minds was like, how do you bridge that gap between what are the problems that exist in the world are and what people can do to resolve them? Also, how can we relay the stories of people we're working with? And for us, that was always in like, media forms in terms of like photography or filmmaking. And I think books are a similar way. Like you mentioned, even if it's a fiction story, a lot of the issues can be related to, like, a lot of people can relate to them because you literally get transported into their world and the world of these characters. And so that's also really important, and speaks to how powerful storytelling can be in inspiring change and inspiring people to actually make a difference. Because once you find a name attached to a statistic, you find out, they have a family, they have a life, and all those types of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. It
And
goes such a long way. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
because even for me, like I said to you, that what led me to actually pen to write a story was because you can imagine, I'd spoken to my daughter. She asked me a question. She said, why would a girl go and live with a family and become a maid, mom? What would lead to that?
Mhm.
And so I went online and I began to check that. But I went through article after article, girl after girl who had been abused and beaten. And I it got to the point where I was like, I'm just tired of this. Who is
Mm-hmm.
this girl? Where are her parents? What's her story? What led her to, what are her dreams? What's her favorite color? What does she like
Yeah.
to girl be? What was the girl in this story before she got to this point? What led her
Yeah.
to this point? And that's why I wrote my book. And so, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, you get desensitized to it, and you don't really, after a while, it's just another, it's like a tick in the box exercise. You're like, yes, I know you're
Mm-hmm.
65% of people out of school. It's a number. But then when you know Aduni who loves to sing and loves to read, and she's funny and she's brilliant and she's kind, you know her story. You finish that, you work with her, and then you finish that walk and you think, I want to do something to help this girl. I want to change
Yeah.
her life in any way I can. And that's the power of storytelling in various forms. I mean, this is great. Media has, sort of news articles and stuff have their place, but so does
Yeah.
photography, sort of film, sort of fiction.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a great point too. Like, and it's interesting how like when sometimes we're not confronted with these questions enough. Like when your daughter asked you, like, like why would a girl not go to school? Like a lot of us understand these statistics. Like, yes, we understand that, so many girls are out of school, but there are so many reasons that go into that decision. Like in our village when we were, going we were also questioning like why are these girls gonna work and as housemaids and why are they leaving? And we learned, yes, it's poverty that is leading to these decisions, but then also just a lack of understanding that girls who study can have better jobs and that can break that cycle of poverty that exists in our village. And so that's an example of a story that I think can definitely apply to so many contexts around the world, whether that's Nigeria or, so many other countries as well. And so, yeah, that's again, the importance of storytelling and finding those root causes, and then that's how you can work your way backwards and address some of these really systemic societal issues like girls unequal access to education that girls face, or gender inequalities globally. And so yeah, storytelling is powerful for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess going off of that and talking about stories and in the media, do you think we're seeing a shift in the media towards these types of stories and finding out like the personal, I guess, the journeys of people on the ground who are facing, I guess, different issues? Or is there any improvement taking place from the types of stories that were told before? What do you think?
I think there's been a lot of, well, at least for me, I didn't come across a shortage of resources in trying to find information about, foiling Aduni's story. There was a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of articles out there. There's a lot of statistics. There's a lot of data. You know, in terms of maybe film, maybe not so much, to be honest. I didn't see, apart from maybe real life experiences in terms of,
Hmm.
films that are sort of made up, sort of fictional stories. I didn't see a lot in terms of fiction novels.
Hmm.
Again, that wasn't that common. I mean, there were one or two
Yeah.
books out there, but I didn't see much, especially, well, I didn't see any for Nigeria, which is why I wrote
Hmm.
mine. But of all over the world, I didn't see that much. I think maybe there was Color Purple, which is kind of a different, it has a different twist to that. But so I think, I mean, to answer your question, I think that there is a lot of room for improvement. I'm
Hmm.
saying to everyone out there, please pick up your pen and tell your stories, write your stories,
Yeah.
type your stories out, because the world needs them. And you can never say it's enough. As long as the issue
Hmm.
persists, as long as the statistics remain what they are, there are 133 million girls out of school today. So
Hmm.
we need to have as many as 133 million stories,
Yes.
one for each
Yeah.
girl. We need to tell the stories. We need to listen to them in any form that we can. Mine is through novel writing, but any way we can, we should do a lot more.
Yeah.
For there's room for improvement.
Absolutely. And in terms of like the experiences you've had sharing your book, what has been one of the like, best responses that you've gotten where you felt like, and you recognize that it's had an impact? Because also like, you've gotten so many awards and things like that, but when you meet people who've read your story, read Adoni's story, and really appreciated your book, that can have a different type of impact. And so would you be able to share a story of someone who has read your book that you've met, and their response to it, and then that's the moment where you recognize that yes, this book has had such an incredible impact. Have you had an experience like that?
It's been amazing. So, as
Yeah.
like I said, I'd been writing in quietly for like 10 years, just sharing my stories around with family and all that, and nothing huge. I really didn't pursue anything huge. And so it took me entering into a competition that was judged anonymously, right? And that's why I entered it. And so that's why I give it as an example, because I felt no one would come and look for me and you say, what a horrible story you wrote. Because I wasn't confident in myself, and which is I'm saying it's okay not to be confident. It's okay for you to have doubt, but don't live on that doubt. Don't dwell on it. Just keep going in spite of that doubt. So be afraid, but do it anyway. And so that was the kind of mindset I had. So I entered into competition and I won that. And so I wasn't expecting this book to be what it is today. I wasn't expecting it to be published, acquired, none of that. And so you can imagine the way I felt, or the way I still feel, when I get messages from people. I had a message from a grandmother who has five granddaughters, or a mother who has five daughters, who said
Mm-hmm.
that I read your book, and I think she's based in the US, and she said that I read your book and I sat my girls down and I told every single one of them that there's nothing stopping you from being who you can or who you want to be. Reach for
Mm-hmm.
your dreams and shatter those glass ceilings and just be everything you want to be, because
Yeah.
if you can become something, you have no excuse. I had another one from somebody who said that she had given up on her education completely. Again, another person based in the US who had access to reasonably great education. And she said she'd given up on it, just couldn't be bothered. And then she realized that this is something I'm taking for granted. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Yeah.
something that somebody else has gone through hell and for. And so she said to me, Abby, I'm going to pick it up again because I read your book. Now, hearing those kind of stories, there's nothing that can prepare you for the joy you feel in your heart, knowing that lives are potentially being changed and transformed for positive because they read the story of this girl.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
it's
really
been
amazing, and I think that I hope that it continues to have an impact. But so far, the impact that it has had, and you're using your platform now to make a difference, and even just having this story out there has really helped, I guess, a lot of girls understand more about the topic of girls' education, whether they come from that background or not. So, thank you for sharing your story once again, and for having this book out there for girls to learn from.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think it goes to show how, for those of us who are afraid to tell our stories, you never know who it could impact, and you never know what kind of difference it could make. And so that should perhaps be another motivating factor for those who are watching, who are hesitating to share their stories and to get it out there. It can make a difference, and it can definitely have an impact. And so we encourage you all to share your stories and pick up that pen, pick up that camera, whatever type of storytelling you like to do, and just go for it. And that's definitely a message we hope you get from this live today.
Absolutely. And I would say something, that there's this thing that you might feel that, well, I'm not in that position. So I was not somebody who was in that. I was not a maid. I
Mm-hmm.
came from, like I said, I came from a bit of privileged background. But don't let that stop you. As long as you're telling the story with empathy, with respect, with good understanding, and the motive behind it is a good one, and you do the right research and you tell the right
Yeah.
stories. I think don't
Mm-hmm.
let that stop you. Tell the story you want to tell, but make sure that you're doing it in the right way. Because, as I was writing this, I constantly kept on making sure that this wasn't a story that was making fun of this girl's
Mm-hmm.
situation. It was a story that
Yeah.
was shedding light and saying, we can do better. Let's be
Mm-hmm.
kinder. Let's reach out for our dreams. So I think that, don't feel that you should, limit your storytelling because you're not in that experience. It's not your experience.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a very important point because I think there's a place for certain authors and storytellers to be able to amplify the voices of those who whose stories that you know whose stories aren't out there. And so if you have a platform, or if you have a gift of storytelling, and you do the right research like you mentioned, then that's the perfect way for you to be able to share other people's stories and have an impact that way as well. And that's really powerful. And is there any final message you'd like to share with our audience members before, the Social Impact Conference organizers come back and end off this live? Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'd say that, apart from saying reach out for your dreams, I would like to say, please extend kindness to the next person, anyone you see around you. And you see, sometimes kindness doesn't even mean leaving your house. It could be just clicking on that link there and donating to the Malala Fund, because you are changing lives by doing that. So please reach out and extend kindness to everyone around you, because that is really what Aduni is
Yeah.
about. She is a kind, loving person who always extends kindness to everyone around her.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us again today. It was so awesome getting to hear about your experiences and also the impact that your book has had. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
And I guess for now we're gonna end off the live. I'm not sure if someone else from the Social Impact Conference is going to join us to finish off, but I guess we'll just wait a second